Hi, everyone. A very warm welcome to this session. I think we will make a start. So if my speakers would like to rejoin their audio and video and come and join me on screen when they're ready, that would be great. This session is called Local Emergencies Within a National Context, How UK Cities Are Developing Innovative Partnership Approaches. Before we get started, just a quick hop-in tutorial if you haven't used the platform before. On the right-hand side, if you go to the chat function, there's two buttons at the top. One says Event and one says Session. If you have any comments or questions for our panel, and I really hope you do, we want this to be an interactive session, do you put them in the tab that says Session? That will be seen by everyone who is here in this session. If you put it in the Event tab, don't worry, I'll be keeping an eye on that one as well, but that message will go to everyone at the conference, which might be your intention, I understand. But if you want to join us in the Session tab, we'll make sure that the speakers get a chance to hear your questions. So we've three fantastic speakers joining us for this session. Dr. Candice Howarth from the Grantham Research Institute, and she wears a few other hats as well we can talk about. Dave Barlow from Manchester City Council and Alex Minshull from Bristol City Council. So we're going to just jump straight in because they've got lots of interesting things to share with us. But do start putting your questions and comments down at any point, or any links from your city that you'd like to share. As I mentioned in the opening, we'll be collecting up all of the comments, links and ideas and sending those back to everyone tomorrow. So Candice, we're going to start with you, if that's okay. Just as an introduction, Dr. Howarth is a co-director of the Place-Based Climate Action Network and a senior policy fellow at the LSE Grantham Research Institute. We're going to help her out by sharing the slides, so you just let us know when you'd like to move forward. Over to you, Candice.
Great, thank you very much. I'll wait for my slides to come up. Great, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and for that warm introduction. As Savita said, I'm one of the co-directors of the Place-Based Climate Action Network, or PCAN, which is all about the translation of climate policy down to the local level. And we do this through a variety of ways. So predominantly through our 3 city commissions that are based in Belfast, Leeds, and Edinburgh, as well as a growing outer network of commissions that bring together a range of different stakeholders who are interested in and pioneering some of the work that we're seeing on climate action at the local level. And we also have 2 thematic platforms, one of which looks at financing of climate action, and the other looks at adaptation in the context of climate action. So if I could have the next slide, please. So as everyone is probably aware here, there is widespread recognition that we're facing a climate emergency. And earlier this year, UNDP and Oxford published a report which showed that 64% of people worldwide recognize that climate change is a global emergency. And this sort of sits alongside the emergency we're seeing around COVID and also a global housing emergency. So climate change is still very much at the top of the agenda. And with that in mind, we know that a lot of action to address climate change takes place at the local level. And this is very much the context within which PCAN works and some of the research that we've been working on that I'll be presenting to you today. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. As some of you may know, we've seen a wave of climate emergency declarations over the last few years, the first of which was in 2016 in Australia. And the first in the UK was in 2018 here in Bristol. So it's great to be hearing from them shortly as well. And since then, we've seen a wave of emergency declarations all over the country, with the UK Parliament declaring a climate emergency at the national level in May 2019. And since then, at the end of 2020, although this figure needs to be updated, we've seen about 78% of local governments who have declared climate emergency. So a massive proportion demonstrating the willingness and the energy to act on climate change. But it's important to bear in mind that these declarations are part of a wider process. They're often framed as the starting gun for action. But actually, as many of you know, action on climate change has been ongoing for a number of years. Next slide, please. And with that in mind, PCAN published a report back in March where we looked at all of the range of declarations that have been made. We provided a snapshot of what's been happening across the UK on climate action. And although 3 out of 4 local authorities have declared an emergency, we found that only 62% have produced either a new or a refreshed climate action plan. So there remains still about 38% of local authorities who haven't yet come up with or made publicly available a plan as to how they're going to deliver on their climate emergency declaration targets. And another aspect that we picked up on was in looking at these different climate emergency declaration, only 12% or less than 12% of them actually mention adaptation in the declaration text. Now, whether this is the word adaptation itself or mention of flooding or heat risk or resilience, we found that 12% was quite a shockingly low proportion, which is framing some of the research of the network going forward. But interestingly, what we're seeing and what we've highlighted in our report is that there's extensive experimentation and innovation around different approaches for climate action. As you may know, you may have heard of the UK Climate Assembly. We're also seeing at the local level, different citizen juries and citizen assemblies, different ways of civil society groups and members of the public engaging in broader discussions of climate action. So it's a very encouraging and energetic space at the moment. And often climate action is combined with tackling other issues at the local level. It isn't just about climate change. It's very much about economic regeneration, ensuring a just transition. And this has been further highlighted by considerations for a post-COVID recovery. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. So as I mentioned, a third of councils with 2030 targets haven't published or updated climate action plans, which is a bit problematic as we need to have a sense of, first of all, where these targets came from, how much they're based on scientific evidence. And secondly, what are the tangible plans and actions that are going to be put in place to deliver some of these targets and to really ensure that these are sustained in the long term and that they address more than one political area or sectoral issue within relevant to the council. And as part of this, and this isn't just specific to climate change really, the research that we've done has really highlighted some of the barriers that are emerging when it comes to climate action. A predominant one is very much linked to lack of capacity or expertise or stretched resources and funding. And the impact of the relationship between the national and local level and the extent to which sometimes the national perspective can actually be limiting the powers to enact some of the activities that are needed at the local level. Another issue that we've highlighted in our report is one in terms of data access and availability. Now, this is both in terms of mitigation and adaptation, although adaptation was found to have much less data available than mitigation. But in terms of issues relating to the way in which data is collected, the way it's reported, and the way it can be used to consistently measure and compare across different local authorities is an area which needs further work. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to the climate emergency declarations, in terms of our analysis, we looked at the way in which these declarations came about and the purpose of these declarations. And what we found is that they come about from a range of different levels. So actively from above, which may have come as a result of devolution or from high-level leadership within a local authority that would be driving the efforts needed on climate change, and in some cases lead to a declaration of climate emergency. We've also seen this in terms of passively from above, so it might have come from an opposition movement to really help drive the need for declaring an emergency. And the most commonly way in which these declarations have come about, we found, is from local activism. So the role of members of the public, civil society organisations, NGOs in helping to drive momentum, both in terms of awareness and understanding of the need to declare an emergency and to really drive some of the activism activities that would lead to the declaration being made. And finally, and the motivation was also in terms of passively from across. So we saw in some of our analysis, particularly in London, that some of these declarations were made as a way of almost jumping on the bandwagon. So neighbouring boroughs would have declared an emergency, and through borough competitiveness, other boroughs have declared their own emergencies. And they have a variety of purposes, really. Some do work just as a statement of intent. They highlight the need for action. They highlight that a particular local authority is driving some of the action, and it's a way of consolidating different pieces of work within that local context. They're also seen as a really interesting and useful way to stimulate local action and to help overcome local barriers. So using the climate narrative as a way to overcome some of the issues or obstacles that might previously have been faced. And they're also ultimately a political gesture, both in highlighting the ambition that is needed, but also some of the limitations that are faced at that particular level. Next slide, please. And so just to give you a snapshot of what we were looking at when we looked at London in particular, from January 2019 until January 2020, 28 of the 32 London councils declared an emergency. Most of these local councils had a net zero target, which ranged from 2025 to 2040, but the predominant target date was 2030, which is quite common and something that we're seeing across the whole country, really. And in terms of the motions that were made in terms of the context of the climate emergency declarations, there are some similarities, some quite strong similarities across the different texts, which suggest that perhaps a template has been used to ensure that consistency. And what these declarations do in London is they highlight the issue of climate change, and many of them refer to the 1.5 degree target outlined in the IPCC report and the Paris Agreement. They tend to highlight some of the actions already underway in the local authorities, but as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing less evidence of tangible actions that will result from these climate emergency declarations. And there's usually a call on national governments to provide additional resources to help deliver some of these actions that are needed to address and achieve the targets at the local level. Next slide, please. So really, in conclusion, I really would hope that from this presentation, the key messages that emerge is that climate emergency declarations are not the starting gun or the starting point for climate action. Climate action has been happening for a number of years. The climate emergency declaration narrative provides a useful frame to bring together a different range of initiatives that can help further action on climate change. And we're seeing this through innovative approaches, whether it's through trying to achieve mitigation targets, but also ways of bringing together and encouraging collaboration at the local level. And as I mentioned earlier, citizen assemblies and juries and the establishment of city climate commissions, for example, are really excellent ways in which these different collaborative processes are bringing together stakeholders to work towards a common goal. But the next stage is really to think about, well, what happens next? Now that these declarations have been made, and we have close to 80% of local authorities having made them, what are some of the tangible actions that are going to be put forward? What are the ways in which these actions are going to be measurable and evaluated going forward? And a key aspect also is to consider the way in which mitigation and adaptation are considered, not only in the declarations, but in resulting plans. As obviously, efforts for both really need to happen in parallel. And a final aspect really is to consider the issue around the fact that many of these local authorities are under-resourced, they're overburdened. So in terms of delivering climate emergency declarations and the targets that might be related to that, and particularly considering the context of COVID-19, climate change has in some areas fallen down the agenda. So we really need to be considering how these declarations can be translated into tangible action that doesn't put further burden on local authorities. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Candice. A really great introduction and national picture. I think we're going to go straight to our other two speakers and then have a kind of a conversation in the round. So Dave Barlow is from Manchester City Council. He's going to share his slides as well and take us on a bit of a spotlight into what's happening on his patch in Manchester.
Hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yep.
Yep, there we go. Thanks for inviting us, everyone. And basically, I'm just going to put like a practical response to everything that Candice has just outlined, really, because I think we're trying to, make things happen on the ground that that build on that momentum that climate emergency has given us. So just a little bit of background. I'm a policy officer within the City Council, and I lead on natural environment strategies, the development of natural environment strategies. So my background is in urban ecology and biodiversity, but it's very much about sort of like the practical green infrastructure agenda. And the city has got its own overarching green infrastructure strategy with a key objective about improving the quality and functionality of the landscape. And now what we can see is, as we've said, this isn't, the climate emergency declaration just didn't come out of thin air, that we actually had like quite a long history in relation to reacting to climate change. Our first climate change strategy was in 2009. But prior to that, we had biodiversity and tree action plans and the like. So building that nested policy hierarchy is really important for us. And climate emergency, as Candice has outlined, has just allowed us to build on that momentum and put the spotlight on the agenda even more. So, for example, recently we've just appointed 3 neighbourhood climate change officers for the first time within the city. So it's a good thing. So what I'm going to be doing really is talking about the green infrastructure element of it. So one key theme of the climate change agenda. And as I said, sort of like the important thing is having this nested policy hierarchy, that it isn't just a standalone document, our green infrastructure strategy for the city. The Our Manchester document at the top there is the Manchester strategy. So the vision for the city over the next 10 years. And above that, we've got our local plan and our climate change action plan. And then below that, we've got bespoke focused strategies in relation to biodiversity parks and trees and woodlands. And we have been trying to capture activity in relation to this agenda. So at the back end of 2019, we did a rough estimation about investment and commitments to green infrastructure projects. And we came up with this figure of £77 million of successful bids and existing revenue commitments working on green infrastructure. So that was complete park budgets and the like, but a significant investment going into this agenda and a significant interest from the public in relation to the agenda. I think that's one of the key things for us. So we were able to demonstrate that even very early on, the direction of travel was positive. And the important thing from our point of view is making sure that that policy narrative is turned into practical action. So it was having like an evidence-based approach, how we were going to find out what the actual needs and wants were of the city. So we worked very closely with an organisation called the West Country Rivers Trust to give us an overview, a natural capital assessment of the city. And that's where some of these slides come from as well. We screen grabbed them. You won't be able to read all the detail of them, but I will send you a link to them. It's just about giving you a flavour of what the document is about. But it is about this thing about, it's not necessarily what a community wants, it's what the city needs that's important. It's also about opportunity and suitability. So a very nuanced response to actually translating how those improvements in quality and function can be translated to on the ground. And this is a slide from that document. The document is called The Nature of Manchester. And this slide, the map on the right represents the city as a linear strip. So when I talk about the city of Manchester, I'm talking about the 115 square kilometres approximately, with about 550,000 people living within the urban centre of the Greater Manchester conurbation. So the city of Manchester is this linear strip, and all the supporting slides that you're going to say, and all the examples I'm going to give relate to the city of Manchester. And what we're able to do is break the city down into its component parts to get under the hood of what's making the city tick. Because it's this type of evidence, this type of intelligence that's going to inform our decision making. And having those consistent data sets allows us to look at where the priorities within the city are. So what we're able to do is look at these indicators here. The one on the left says access to green and blue spaces, and the other one is the impacts of air pollution. So using strong data sets then allow us to understand where priority interventions might need to happen. And the way we present this is we have this net benefits wheel approach. So the wheel on the right-hand side there demonstrates or indicates 12 different area or thematic priorities for the city: property value, flood risk, access to nature, biodiversity, air quality, all those ecosystem services. And each area of the city can be given its own score. Now, this isn't an exact science, but it's a brilliant way of starting the conversation with stakeholders, whether they are communities, whether they are councillors. People just get it if you can able to say that this is what the challenge is, and these are some of those possible solutions. So we're able to translate that and create thematic priorities within the city. So this is a data set. Again, don't worry about the detail, but what it does quite clearly is indicate where the deficiencies are in relation to street tree cover within the city. Very easy there. The red dots on the right-hand side indicate that there is definitely a north-south divide within the city of Manchester as regards street tree cover, and that has yielded results. That evidence has led to us being able to come up with the city supporting £1 million tree planting project over the next 2 years to actually have focused tree planting in those areas of need within the city. So this thematic focus has been extended further. So we've got our overarching GI strategy, but these emerging themes are coming out of it. Trees is one theme, climate resilience is another, biodiversity is another, and also, we'll leave it on quite quickly because of time. Yeah, we're looking at the tree side of things by actually we've come up with this beacon trees mapping tool that allows communities to indicate where trees would be needed and wanted within their communities. And then this intelligence can then be interpreted by our tree officers to see what's viable and what's suitable for these areas. So just like quite a quirky but an interesting way of engaging stakeholders on that journey. The other key focus one of the other key themes is around our river valleys. Manchester's got 5 river valleys, and we've commissioned a piece of work called Our Rivers, Our City, which is very much looking at this international concept of sponge city and permeability to cope with the challenges of flood risk. The images on the right show a flooded river in Manchester at the early start of this year, which led to large-scale neighbourhood evacuation. So a significant piece of work, which again will hopefully provide us with some of the evidence and focused action plans to make a difference on the ground to increase that permeability or sponginess of the city. And this is one of our flagship projects, really, working with the Wildlife Trust around creating a new biodiversity strategy for the city, a completely new approach, a new way of doing things by entering into a collaborative partnership with the Wildlife Trust. And this has been amazing. It's called My Wild City, builds on the Bristol model that I'm sure you've heard about or will hear about. But it's very much a 4-year programme working with communities to develop strong evidence that's going to lead to a new action plan for biodiversity in the city. The 2 reports on the left, I'll send you links to these because they're brilliant. The My Wild City report was a pre-COVID community consultation with about 2,000 people responding to it, saying how positive nature was in their lives. The Value in Nature Nearby report was a during COVID response that said, guess what? It's even more important now. So it backs up any of the recommendations that might come from the action plan. And we're really excited about the way My Wild City has developed as a concept. In the past, the city might have taken it on board themselves to deliver this strategy in isolation, but working with stakeholders, we've actually relinquished control, which is pretty difficult from a local authority point of view, and said, over to you. Start that conversation in a different way, engage with new audiences and new partners. And we're very excited about the way My Wild City is evolving. In relation to climate resilience, we've got a number of partner projects that we're working with across, globally, really. The Grow Green project here is a partnership with 22 partners, 6 main partners within Europe and Wuhan in China, to look at climate resilient projects that build our knowledge base around, certainly around heat stress and also around flooding. In Manchester, this has led to the creation of a new £1.5 million new sponge park, effectively, which has got 7 years worth of monitoring built in, so we can actually see the changes that improving the functionality of a space can have on a particular neighbourhood at risk of flooding. And this has been incredibly well received by local people. This particular space was a rundown park with a set of swings in it. It's now an incredible place for people to meet. It's got rain gardens, it's got swales, wildflower areas, all the water running off into that is being monitored over a course of time. So we'll have all that compelling evidence and those compelling stories. That means that we can do this elsewhere, or we can take elements of it and apply them already in different parks and spaces across the city. But it's not to say we haven't been doing this already. The picture on the left is Manchester in the late 1970s. In fact, that's my playground. Not very nice. It looks like a scene from the Somme in 1914. But that's the River Medlock running through the city of Manchester. We have got a track record of making things happen. This space is now a local nature reserve. It's now got a world-class mountain biking facility with it. With the right will, with the right commitment, with the right partnerships and collaboration, we can really make a difference. And I would say this, I'm a policy officer, but having a plan and having that understanding, having that baseline really helps. I'll just read one of these quotes for you because it might be a bit faded on your screen. But without a clear policy and strategy for GI in Manchester, our project and the other funding bids currently in development simply would not have been possible. Really important to have a plan. So my message really would be that, you know, we can take on board what Candice has said. We can be inspired. We want to be informed. And my message would be bold and be radical. And people will come with us on this journey. It's about changing our behaviours as city council officers, as communities. It's the whole shooting match, really. So, yeah, that's me anyway. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave. If you can either send me some of those reports that you mentioned or pop them in the chat, then we'll make sure it goes in the kind of write up to everyone.
Yeah, I'll definitely make sure to send links because we've got links to all the documents that are out there.
Okay, perfect. And before we get on, just a reminder, you know, pop your comments and your questions in the chat. We've had a couple already. Candice, if you're there, a question from Francesca about a finance firm. I think that's for you. Maybe a specific question you can pick up in the chat. And also Chris has asked a great question about examples from around the world. So while we're hearing from Bristol, if you know some other examples, you can either describe or put some links in. It would be great to get your experience. So we'll hand over to Alex for a bit more info from Bristol.
Great, thanks, Savita, and thanks very much to Dave and Candice. And I'll try and pick up some of the themes they've been talking about. I'm sorry, I can match Dave's picture set. I'm afraid we're going to move to some slightly more texty slides. So apologies for that. But I'm Alex Minshull. I'm Sustainable City and Climate Change Manager at Bristol City Council, and I'm going to talk a bit about how we've been responding in Bristol to both the climate and ecological emergencies. I'm going to talk a bit about what Dave's almost said at the very end thing about having a plan and the importance of having a plan. I'm going to talk a bit about how we all got people together to kind of create the plan and now to implement it. And Bristol was the first city to declare the climate emergency a couple of years ago now, and seen that sort of snowball, if that's not a bad metaphor for a climate analogy, around the country. And so just talk a bit about what we've been doing since then in terms of responding to that. So the first thing that was important was that whilst the City Council may have declared the emergency, we couldn't respond to the emergency on our own. But then we don't respond to other major emergencies in the city. We respond as part of multi-agency emergency management arrangements. And so what we've done is we've created two systems that can help respond to that. So components, I suppose. And they both sit within the overall system city approach, which is recognizing that you need to bring organizations together, you need to bring partners together to be able to deliver better outcomes for the people of the city. And so on the left hand here, we've got our strategic coordinating group, our gold command for the climate and ecological emergencies. And this is the One City Environment Board, and they provide us with that guidance and commissioning of the development of our strategies. And that's chaired by was chaired by the mayor, now by cabinet member, co-chaired with in this case Anne Cousins, who joins us from Arup Consultant. And what that multi-agency, there's a lot around that table are lots of organisations with influence in the city, whether that's because they're big operations in the city, big business in the city, or because they're an important part of the learning and education in the city. The other group that we've got is our Advisory Committee on Climate Change. It's a bit like the National Committee on Climate Change, but in this emergency setting, this is our SAGE. This is our scientific advisory group. And we all heard of that from COVID. Well, this is our version in Bristol, able to offer advice, but also to challenge the City Council, the One City Environment Board, and the One City structure more broadly to ensure that we are delivering on the rate and scale of change that's needed on climate change in particular. So we've done a lot of work to develop the evidence base that Dave alluded to, but I'll spare you that, and there's a slide at the end that you can have some links on it for you. But what we've developed is a pair of strategies to address both the ecological emergency and the climate strategy. And the reason we've got two different strategies, not one, is because they were developed at different times. We developed the climate strategy in response to the climate emergency, and then we declared the ecological one later, and so that strategy had to come later. But there is, I've drawn them wrong here. I should have drawn them with quite a significant overlap in them, because much of the action in the ecological strategy addresses some of the nature aspects of the climate strategy as well. And our climate,
Alex, yeah. I'm going to jump in and interrupt you. Are you intending to be sharing slides?
Oh,
we don't see any slides, and suddenly you mentioned a slide, and we are saying in the chat, oh, we don't actually see any slides. I thought you were going.
No, I'm really glad you jumped in there, because I didn't share the slides, so that's going to
fantastic.
This might help.
Thank you, Emily, in the chat for.
Thank you. Yeah.
Compliment you for sharing it with us. So feel free to jump back to where you were. Thank you, everyone in the chat.
So I was happily clicking through them. So let's just see if we've missed anything that's important. No, just me, and then there are two groups of people who are working with us, and then the two covers, which are not very exciting. So if we just look at a little bit about the ecological strategy, and what we've set out in there are 4 goals around about how do you create the space for nature in the city. And much of what Dave's been talking about doing in Manchester is doing just that kind of green infrastructure space. The second area was around pesticides and making sure that we address pesticide pollution within the city, but also in our rivers and catchments. Or pesticide pollution within the city, and the City Council has an important role in that, but as do all the people who use pesticides. But also then how the pollution that we're causing, and particularly in the rivers, and the world is much more conscious of aquatic pollution now, and how our rivers are connected to those oceans. But also we need to be cognizant of our wider footprint. So the goods and materials that we consume, things like peats and timbers and stuff that have obvious ecological footprints all the way around the world. And so we've set out a strategy that's not just about what we're doing in the, if you like, just obviously in the city, but our wider ecological footprint. And now the slides aren't moving forward from here. We're only going down. Am I clicking the wrong place? There we go. Too many screens here. That's the problem. Within the climate strategy, we've picked up 10 different themes, and that perhaps tells you a bit about the more complex nature of work on climate, or the more all-encompassing nature on climate. And I say a couple of these, particularly kind of natural environment, is obviously, and food, where there's very strong links with the ecological strategy as well. But we've tried to be fairly comprehensive, and there's a set of things topics there, which you could divide in many other different ways. What we thought was quite important when we were looking at the climate strategy was to recognise what we need as the enabling conditions for change. And so at the top there, we talked a bit about data, and Dave talked very clearly and showed some great images of the way they're using data in Manchester, and we're definitely picking your brains on that one. But also then the recognition that we need the funding, and that a lot of that funding is built off the evidence base that we've been talking about, but also the role of national government in action and creating the right context for action in the city. And then there are the skills that we need to deliver in the climate context, a transformation of our energy systems and our homes. But crucially, we also, and perhaps this should be the top of the picture, particularly for democratic organisations like city councils, we need people. We need the citizens to want to and to give us permission to make the changes to their lives, but also the systems that the city operates on. And that infrastructure that underpins the low carbon lifestyle or the ecologically rich city is really important that we get that right. And so, if you like, we've created that one city strategy, and notice the colour change. City colour scheme and design into the city council's template. And now I'm going to just talk a little bit about the work that we're doing within the city council and how that fits in with the work we're doing in the wider region, and our joining, thanks Jane, our wide joining authorities who are working on both climate and ecological issues, because obviously neither of those things stop at our boundary, and we won't be anywhere near successful unless we include our the adjoining authorities and also therefore the combined authority as well, drawing upon their skills, their competencies, for example, in strategic planning, which is going to be quite important about how we protect and manage that the green infrastructure as well as the climate. So just going to focus a little bit about what we've been doing within City Council, and much like in Manchester, we didn't start work on climate change or ecological matters when we made the declarations. Those declarations were made in recognition of the need to increase the scale and pace of action. And if you want the full presentation, I've got lots of slides showing how it's carbon emissions having to suddenly drop off a cliff. But what we've done we've already got a lot happening, and we're accelerating a lot of those things, from £1 billion of investment in energy infrastructure to development of new tree planting schemes and green infrastructure, much as you've seen in Manchester, and it's really inspiring to see what you're doing there. But if we look at our new climate and ecological emergency programme, and what this has tried to do is address actually some of the points that Candice referred to in her earlier presentation about local authorities and their resources and their skills and their capacity to be able to respond to this. So what we've done is we've created a new climate change team, rather than just having one or two people working on climate change. And also we've created a dedicated post of ecological emergency project manager, and her role is to draw together all the work that's happening across the City Council in many different departments and ensure that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Had to make sure I got that one the right way around. We've also kicked off about 20 new projects, and some of those I'll refer to now. So there's sort of 4 layers to our work in that. Firstly, it's about the City Council leading by example. So ensuring that we address our property estate, our new capital programme, and all our procurement in a way that makes us zero carbon, climate resilient, ecologically rich, in all the bits, all those 3 Ps. So the buildings that we already own, the land that we already own, how do we make that more ecologically diverse? How do we make that more climate resilient? How do we make that zero carbon? And we've got work going on at the moment to understand where we are and dedicated resources over the next couple of years to really try and shift that and shift the dial on those areas. It's also important that we align our strategies and our plans on energy, transport, waste, and so on around those goals. And the role, for example, of our ecological project manager, Sarah Jackson, is to try and ensure that some of our plans are all starting to dovetail with those, creating our own City Council action plan for the ecological emergency that knits all that together. But we also recognise that no matter how good the City Council is, in both as an organisation, as a corporation, and as a service provider and a strategy maker in the city, we can only do so much. And what we need to do is enable organisations and others in the city to do more. And so we've been part of our programme. We've got support for businesses, enabling them to particularly address their carbon footprints. We're working with other public bodies about how they use their land, for example, and we're supporting communities with a host of citizen-led projects in different communities around the city, some of those communities of interest and some communities of place. And also supporting some of the networks that enable those communities to be even more effective and even more effective at, for example, securing funding from the National Lottery or elsewhere. And finally, there's sort of supporting our action by citizens. So both kind of trying to ensure they've got the information they need and that they've got the awareness and understanding. So what does ecology mean? What does some of the language that we use, trying to demystify some of that language, trying to find ways of communicating with them in ways that they understand rather than making them learn our languages. Trying to inspire them with the stories of what they're doing, stories of what their neighbours are doing, stories of what their peers are doing elsewhere in the city, might encourage them to do more. And finally, then more practical support. And that could be, for example, through community grants or other measures that make them doing the right thing more easy. And the one thing I didn't add in there, which is to listen. And so, for example, one of the things we did as part of our climate assembly was called a citizens assembly with a very strong focus on climate change to understand what citizens wanted and what their priorities were around, in that case, heat decarbonisation. And the little graphic on the right hand side that you're not intended to read is drawn from the Committee on Climate Change's report to government on the 6th carbon budget and the role of local authorities. And that's really just to show the concentric circles that they use in their model. I've used 4 circles, actually the other way up than their diagram shows it, but it's really just to say there is a model out there that you could draw upon if you're wanting to think about it from the government's perspective, about the different roles that you as a local authority can play in your city. And whilst that one's written about climate change, I'm pretty sure it holds fairly well for ecological matters as well. Okay. I think that's it from me. So sorry. And then finally, I've got a slide at the end with some of the links to, gives you a bit of overview and some of the links to our documents. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And to all of our speakers, we've had a couple of questions through, and Alex, maybe one specific one that you might want to look at. But if you could stop sharing your slides, and I could bring our speakers back. We've only got a few minutes, and we'll be going back to going on to our next sessions, but we'll kind of continue the discussion as we go. I mean, I just thought I might circle back to you, Candice. It was great to kind of hear this overall UK perspective and then how that plays in on the ground. I'm just wondering if there's anything in particular that kind of resonated from Dave or from Alex that that matched up what you were hearing in your research from other places.
Yeah, I mean, Dave, Alex, thank you so much for those overviews. It's really good to get a sense of the tangible action that's happening on the ground. And it certainly mirrors a lot of what we're seeing in our own climate commissions. I guess a question which is coming out of the research and my own personal interest is how much in, say, the work of Manchester and Bristol, are there considerations for where this fits into the national picture? Obviously, we have the national net zero target, we have our NDC. Does that feature at all in the work that's going on in Manchester and Bristol, or is the focus, understandably, just very much on those cities without necessarily thinking about how that would then feed back into the national level?
So with the climate change bit, shall I pick that up if that's okay? So I suppose one of the challenges for us is that we're trying to move so much quicker than national government. It's that there is a definite tension between their time frame and ours. And no, but we haven't. I don't think we've actively gone, yes, would therefore be our contribution to the NDC, mainly because actually, in reality, we can't make that contribution unless government puts in place the measures that would make it happen, probably nationally. So I think that there's a bit like that. But I think there is a real challenge of how you all those changes that need to happen locally and nationally, and it's both and, rather than thinking you can do it at just one level.
Steve, do you want to give a quick thought? We're out of time. We've had some great comments there, but a very quick thought before we close up.
Well, and just in relation to national government, just echoing what Alex has said, really, we've got strong local targets. I think, the dialogue with national government, again, we've had quite a positive one, but it's something whereas, it needs, it needs bold visionary leadership from government, really, in relation to the agenda to support local authorities across the country.
Great. Fantastic. Well, a very big thank you to all of our speakers, and for those of you adding some comments in the chat as well. We'll make sure we pick those up as the afternoon goes on. But a big thank you to you all. We'll release you now to find your next sessions and keep the conversation going.
Bye.